Welcome everybody to today's webinar, the LGBTQ Wealth Market, Understanding the Equality Economy. My name is Ted Everett and I'm a member of the CFA Society of Boston's Education Advisory Council. And I want to thank you for joining us today and welcome our speaker, Jean Dunn. I also want to thank Rowe Price for making Jean available to present this discussion, and to thank Karen Igler in particular, Rowe Price's Regional Account Manager, for connecting us with Jean. Before I introduce our speaker, though, I do want to do a little CFA business, Boston business first, and remind folks of two upcoming events. First, on May 21st, there is a virtual career chat on biotechnology portfolio management featuring Dr. Robert Derisiewicz, Senior Managing Editor and Partner at Wellington Management. Bob's a 20-year veteran of Wellington's healthcare team, specializing in biotechnology. Then on May 27th, there is a virtual meetup, Mind the Generally Accepted Accounting Principles Gap. It's a mouthful. Over the last decade, the number of gap adjustments has proliferated among publicly traded companies, providing management various levers to hide financial and operational risks. Dan Mahoney, head of industrials research at CFRA, will explore the pros and cons of the most frequent adjustments and identify which may be the most useful to investors. To check for specific times, sign up for these events, or to get updates in general about CFA Boston activity, go to the Society's website, or you can also join and follow activity via the Connect Communities, CFA Boston's communications platform. Let's turn now to today's presentation. By now, you probably had your fill of webinars on COVID-19 related topics and anxious client calls discussing the financial aftermath. So today we are stepping back to do a little traditional market analysis, looking at the LGBTQ slice of the wealth market and how to think about addressing this community and its unique needs. The LGBTQ community is believed to represent just over 4% of the total US population, with an estimated buying power topping $900 billion. According to Gallup research, the Boston area is tied for 5th among the top 10 US metro areas for residents self-identifying as LGBTQ. The need for proper asset allocation and financial advice knows no specific gender or orientation, but there are unique aspects of LGBTQ lives that inform appropriate investment programs and are key to connecting with this community. Based on proprietary Rowe Price research, our presenter is going to share some insights on just how to make connections with this group. Jean Dunn is a vice president of Rowe Price Associates and Client Loyalty Insights leader. She creates thought leadership and provides consultative services with clients and prospects on financial services marketing, client loyalty, and segmentation insights. She is a Series 6, 7, and 63 registered rep and a Series 24 registered principal. She is also a certified financial planner. Today's presentation is just one of a client loyalty series. Other topics cover how to create client loyalty across multi-generations by understanding family dynamics, and how to authentically connect with women investors. If later you're interested in hearing about these other series or seeing the presentations, please contact Karen Igler. Her email is Karen with a K .igler@troprice.com. Okay, now, two last details before I turn things over to Jean. We will be answering questions via the chat box at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to enter them as they occur to you. And slides will also be available after the presentation. So Jean, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ted, and everyone, thanks so much for joining in today. You know, the face of wealth is changing in the United States. It's becoming younger, more diverse, and essentially having different values than the prior face of wealth. And at Rowe Price, we're committed to understanding this changing face of wealth by doing in-depth proprietary research and understanding the risk and the opportunities that it presents financial advisors. And it's exciting to me to present this opportunity to you today. Rowe Price is committed to diversity and inclusion, And we've done some proprietary research on LGBTQ investors, which we feel is a growing part of America, and we also think it's a growing opportunity for financial advisors. So I'm going to share with you information about this group today. I'm going to talk about the overview of that proprietary research that Ted mentioned. And finally, I'm going to share some specific action items, ideas for you to authentically connect with the LGBTQ community. And we developed this term called the equality economy, and I'll talk to you a little bit about why we developed this term and why we think it's important. And one of the things you may be thinking about is why should I think about serving this community? And one of the things I think is interesting is there's actually over 1.4 million American business owners who identify as LGBTQ. In sum, those businesses generate 1.7 trillion. Taken together, that's the 10th largest economy in the world. And Ted shared some of these other stats that you see on your screen today. It's definitely true. It's you'll see different stats, but between 4 and 4.5% of the community of America identifies themselves as LGBTQ. But when we look at the younger generations, millennials, and even Gen Z after that, we actually see a much higher number. You can see 20% of millennials associate as LGBTQ. And the equality economy is definitely obviously comprised of Americans that identify as LGBTQ, but we actually think the influence is much larger. You can see almost 90%, over 92% of Fortune 500 companies have non-discrimination policy based on sexual orientation. At Rowe Price, one of the things that I'm very proud of at Rowe Price is we actually have 3 business resource groups. We have a business resource group for women, we have a business resource group for multicultural groups, and we also have a business resource group called Pride, which focuses on helping our associates, our LGBTQ associates. So you can see it's not just the community, there's actually a larger community that is really focused and wants to make sure that there are LGBTQ friendly allies and businesses. You can see 50% of adults say gay people have the same rights as everyone else. So I think it's important to recognize the equality economy is not just members of the LGBTQ community, it's all of the groups that surround and support the community as well. So just to dive in a little bit on the research that we did. So we actually surveyed over 1,300 members of the LGBTQ community. And you can see on this slide some of the stats of the people that we surveyed. So over 74% of them had household income over 100,000. Over 72% of them had savings and assets, investable assets, over 100,000. And it was about half self-stated that they shared equally in the decision-making of investment decisions of the household. And so what did we find out? We found out that LGBTQ investors are definitely open to advice. So over 54% of the participants in our research worked with a financial advisor. What we found really interesting is that the individuals that had a higher number of assets, so you can see 71% of individuals with assets over 500,000 worked with a financial advisor. And we saw as the individuals in our survey had a higher level of assets, the propensity for them to use a financial advisor actually went up over time. So this is definitely a group that is open to financial advice. So when we got into asking participants in the survey why they were focused on investing, retirement, and I don't think that this is surprising, retirement was definitely a strong motivator to invest. LGBTQ investors take pride in being self-reliant. And we think that, in fact, many individuals in the community share a common mindset. When they're thinking about long-term security, members of the community are making sure that they are self-reliant and self-independent. And we think that this motivation is really driven by cultural and legal issues. And we all know that when we've looked at the rights of LGBTQ members, it's definitely evolved over time. We also know the experience of members in the LGBTQ community can emphasize the importance of self-reliance. And when we're thinking about self-reliance, obviously a component of self-reliance is financial independence. And that goes back to this whole point of LGBTQ investors really being open to financial advice and working with financial advisors. This next slide, I think, is really interesting and shows maybe how far our industry needs to go and where the opportunity lies. So we just asked a simple question. Hey, how LGBTQ friendly do you consider these companies to be? And we put in Rowe Price, and the firms underneath, we didn't actually put their names, but there are other financial services firms that you would easily recognize. And you can see, 90% of participants in our research simply weren't sure if Rowe Price was LGBTQ friendly. And the numbers, obviously, for other companies weren't dramatically that different. And as I shared with you before, I think Rowe Price has been on a journey. And I'm proud to say that I think we are actually a very LGBTQ friendly firm. However, we haven't translated that to the broader population. And I would say, as you can see from this slide, neither has many other financial services firms. So we see this as a key opportunity for each one of you. If you can demonstrate that you are supportive of the LGBTQ community, I think you will have the opportunity to connect and serve LGBTQ investors. Another question that we asked about was just trying to determine how important LGBTQ related reasons were for these individuals when choosing a financial advisor. And not surprisingly, and you won't see this on the screen, but not surprisingly, the number one reason individuals in the survey chose a financial advisor was through a referral. And that referral may or may not be part of the community. But when we're looking at LGBTQ related reasons, what we found interesting is that one of the most important things, so if you can look at the slide, we've got LGBTQ investors with a financial advisor on the left and LGBTQ investors who do not have a financial advisor on the right, and the dark blue is indicating very important. So you can see on both groups, working an advisor who is working with a company known to be supportive of the community was one of the most important elements. What was less important was that the advisor is actually part of the LGBTQ community. So I think that's important to recognize. You don't have to be part of the community to actually serve the LGBTQ community. You just have to demonstrate that you're an authentic ally. So just in terms of a high level of what we learned in terms of the actual research, we know that LGBTQ investors are open to advice. They are self-reliant and independent, and they want to work with allies. And so I'm going to share with you, the next part of the presentation is really some ideas on how you can perhaps demonstrate your commitment to the LGBTQ community. The first thing that I'll share with you is that I just spent just a couple minutes overviewing some of the highlights of the survey. There were many, many questions that we don't necessarily have time to go over today, but the survey is outlined in detail in a white paper, and I'll share with you. Obviously, you're going to get a survey after the participation in this webinar today, and if you complete that survey, you'll get access to this presentation, and you'll be able to access the Equality Economy white paper, which goes over the presentation in more detail. And so if I was going to recommend what are some of the things you're thinking about this community, you think there may be an opportunity for you to increase your number of clients who are members of this community, what should you do? And there's two simple things. So one is making sure that you're learning about the community, and that starts with that white paper, but I'll also share with you, there's many other resources that you can learn about the community. And the second thing is to act. And I'm going to give you a step-by-step process on how you can, again, locally demonstrate your commitment to the LGBTQ community. And there can be, large and small gestures that you can do. If any of you are familiar with the HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, one financial advisor shared with me, and you can go on their website and download their logo. And you can also, I think, purchase their logo. It's a blue square with a yellow equal sign. And so one financial advisor shared, in a really simple way, I make sure I have that HRC logo in my office so that individuals can see that I am supportive of the community without explicitly asking. So it's basically a very easy way to demonstrate your support. So it can be smaller gestures like that, and I'll also share some larger activities that you can do as well. So we have the equality economy. We also have an infographic that talks in more detail, and a website. And again, you can access all of these if you complete that survey after the presentation. But the other thing I just want to share, and oftentimes when I'm doing this presentation, an advisor might come up to me before the presentation or even after, and the first thing that they'll do is say, I have a lot of questions that I want to ask about the community. I'm an ally. I'm not necessarily a member of the community, and I want to make sure I'm serving these clients in a way that is authentic and honors them. But there's some things that I feel like I don't even know about, and I'm uncertain even of the questions to ask. And so in the resources that we've done, we've really tried to start from square one. So assuming there's no level of knowledge, let's just spend a couple minutes on the acronym. So LGBTQ in and of itself. And I think it's important to recognize, even before I get into the actual acronyms themselves, recognize that the LGBTQ community is not representative of a community that has all of the same ideas and opinions. So there is obviously, as with any community, disagreements and different points of view within the community in and of itself. But LGBTQ is an acronym that describes non-heterosexual orientations. It means lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer and questioning. And I think it's important to recognize that the term itself is shorthand. There are many other identifications in this inclusive community other than these. And I think it's also important to recognize that it's been a journey in terms of the acronym in and of itself. And we've seen the acronym change over time. Individuals at one point in time use the term transsexual, which we would say is an outdated term, and the more appropriate term is transgender. I also want to address queer. So the term queer, to some members of the LGBTQ community, I think there's a difference of opinion, and I'll make a generalization, so there's always exceptions, but in general, members of the community that are older may take offense to the word queer. They may not think that it's an appropriate term. But what's really interesting is, again, millennials and that Gen Z, so that generation younger than millennials, actually use the word queer and have said, we think this is a term of empowerment, and it's something that they use to describe themselves. So again, just recognizing that all members of the community don't necessarily have the same point of view, but it's good to have a foundation of knowledge of each of these different terms. So how do you take that information? One of the things that I think, one piece of advice that I heard when we were discussing the LGBTQ community is don't assume. And I think that's a great piece of advice. Never assume anything when you're working with a member of the community. And it may even be not assume that they're a member or not a member of the community. And I'll give you a couple examples. So for couples, I think using the term partners is always a polite way to address a couple. Obviously, LGBTQ and gay individuals have the right to marry, but what's interesting is when we've actually looked at individuals in the community, and I think that it's relatively, 2015 was 5 years ago, so it's a relatively short period of time. We saw the rate of same-sex partners getting married was about 7.9% that year. We've seen it grow a little bit. So in 2017, it was over 10%, but it's still far lower than the 50% of all American adults who are married. So I think don't assume that people are actually married, even if they have the right to be married. The other thing that I think is important is not to assume gender. You can ask, hey, what pronoun do you prefer? But again, it's that whole point of asking questions, I think, is more important than trying to make assumptions. Listening and having an open mind. But I also think it's important, you should never ask someone whether they're a community or not. You really want them to control the conversation, and you want them to share what they're comfortable sharing with you. Another thing that I think is important, so I mentioned the Human Rights Campaign. They have a great glossary of terms. Again, you can see that this is an active link, so if you want access to the presentation, I think that's a helpful, more in-depth discussion. I just kind of gave you the high-level overview to learn more about the terms. The other thing, so to me, this is an interesting slide. So how can you demonstrate your commitment to the LGBTQ community? Again, we heard you don't necessarily have to be a member of the community, but if you can demonstrate your commitment, the community may be interested in working with you. You can see, so what we have is basically different types of activities an advisor can do. The number one answer, which was very important, so you can see 75% of respondents said, don't donate to anti-LGBT political candidates. So what that suggests to me, again, is that that bar is very low, building on the fact that, 90% of respondents didn't know if Rowe Price was, LGBTQ friendly or not, and they don't actually know that about most financial firms. I think the bar is low for you to demonstrate your commitment, but there are some specific ways for you to find out local communities, LGBTQ communities and groups in your area, and demonstrate your support. And that could be volunteering, that could be going to an event. June is Pride Month coming up. I recognize that it may look a little bit different based on social distancing guidelines, but maybe there's some virtual events that you could start to attend in your community to demonstrate your commitment to the LGBTQ community. So you can see there's obviously giving to LGBTQ causes is important, but the bar to me is pretty low when the number one answer was don't donate to anti-LGBTQ political candidates. So how do you find a group in your area? And this, to me, starts with a simple Google search. You can also go to the Human Rights Campaign website. You can find LGBTQ Center. You can also look at Out and Equal. So one opportunity you may think about doing, I mentioned that Rowe Price has this Pride group. So again, it's an employee resource group. So for associates that are members of the LGBTQ community, we've developed this employee resource group, and we have events, both virtual and, before 2020, we had in-person events. And I'm a member of our Pride group. I'm also a member of our women's group. And one of the challenges I'll just share with you is thinking about relevant topics to bring our members together. And so one suggestion you may think of doing is actually finding, again, maybe a company with offices in your area that has an employee resource group that's supportive of the LGBTQ community. Reach out to that company, and you could reach out to their head of diversity and inclusion, or you could reach out to the head of the employee resource group and just introduce yourself and say, hey, I'm a financial advisor who is focused on serving LGBTQ investors. And I actually have a presentation around the unique needs of LGBTQ investors. And Rowe Price, we've actually developed a presentation that's similar to this, but focused on individual investor audience that you could use. And you could say, hey, how about I do a presentation to your group? And just think about that. Again, you're proactively contacting a group in your community, and you're demonstrating your support of the LGBTQ community. I've spent, and you can just see here, so we actually give you a script that you could potentially use in that introductory conversation. But I think the most important thing for you to do is to show up, to demonstrate your support by showing up locally. And I'll just share with you, I've worked with several financial advisors since we rolled this out over the last year or so, and I've heard a lot of different stories. I'll share one financial advisor. It was really interesting to me. He was in Texas, and one of his clients was had unfortunately passed away unexpectedly. He was a member of the LGBTQ community, and he did not have heirs, so his entire estate actually went to several local LGBTQ community groups. And so the financial advisor, in the process of helping distribute the estate, actually met several of these local community leaders. And he shared with us that he, as a result of working for his client, working through his client's distribution of his estate, he actually had 50 new referrals. And that, I didn't say 5, I didn't say 15, 50 new referrals. Another financial advisor that I talked to took the approach that I'm suggesting, more similar. So he had been working with an individual that was part of the community in a large corporation. So he worked for a large corporation, and his client simply said, you know what, and this was a little bit more organic than what I'm suggesting, but he said, you know what, I'm part of this business resource group within my firm, and I know some individuals are looking for a financial advisor, but they're not quite sure where to find one that understands our community's unique needs and is supportive. And so he was able to acquire several new clients just through his service of that one client. So sometimes there can be organic ways, but obviously I'm sharing a little bit more of a proactive way to grow your LGBTQ clients. So as part of the event, we have a customizable email invite. We've got a presentation and even a sign-in sheet. All of these things, again, you'll be able to access when you complete the survey and get the presentation after our deck today. And the last thing I'll share with you is that definitely make sure that you're using, I know that Ted mentioned this earlier, Karen Eigler. Karen is definitely a resource for you. So if you want to dive deeper into this topic and learn more about the resources that Rowe Price has available, feel free to do so. She is happy to help support your efforts. The last thing that I just want to share with you before we start to get into questions is in my conversations with financial advisors who have been thinking about how they can better connect with LGBTQ investors, I would say there's typically a couple of different questions I think that I've heard. So one of them is, hey, from a financial planning standpoint, are there things that I should be thinking about? Are there nuances that I should know? And one of the things that I'll share with you is, again, and not necessarily all financial advisors understand this, but with the Supreme Court ruling in 2015, in all 50 states, individuals are eligible for gay marriage. So certainly that was a huge financial planning consideration that has changed over the last few years. However, the one thing I will share with you, again, goes back to this point of the rates of individuals that are part of this community that are married are lower than the general community. So if you're thinking about estate planning for this community, to me, it's appropriate for all of the estate planning efforts that you do for your single individuals. So thinking about wills, healthcare power of attorneys, durable power of attorneys. There's also even, making sure your individuals have filled out a HIPAA privacy authorization. So if, they have a partner that is not married, making sure that partner has access to medical records is important. And obviously beneficiaries are something that is critically important as well. So I'm going to pause right there. And perhaps, Ted, we can see what questions folks have for us.
Sure. We're a little light right now, but we'll give folks a chance to weigh in with questions. I have a couple of thoughts that I'd ask you. Just sort of following on your comments about financial planning, in general, the Marriage Act is fairly new, and I think there are still probably state by state differences as to how a number of these financial issues are handled: marriage, divorce, adoption, children in general, and the attendant financial needs that come from that. Are there particular issues? Are there particular nuances that folks might focus on? You had said you want to potentially go to a group and offer a presentation. I guess the question is, what would you present? What case study might you look at that's unique to a lesbian couple or some particular group within this community?
So one thing that I would share in the investor presentation that we have really provides an overview of the financial planning needs of the entire community. So obviously there's a lot of alignment with just any needs. So when you're thinking about retirement needs, that's critically important. I would definitely suggest not to go into a specific situation, a large presentation, but address that with the individual. One thing that I definitely have heard from some financial advisors that can be, one example of a situation is the use of pronouns in wills. And sometimes, so this is maybe for the clients themselves, but it also could be the parents of the client and how they've, addressed individuals. So it's important to have a really good, when you're having a discovery process with a client, you're thinking not just of themselves, but also perhaps their family members who they may or may not have, relationships with. But that's important. Beneficiaries is also something I think, it feels a lot obvious, but that can be critically important, especially if individuals, don't have children and are not married. We obviously know the critical importance of beneficiaries, but we still see, a higher rate of accounts that don't have beneficiaries or outdated beneficiaries. So I think, to me, the important point would not necessarily be sharing a case study with a group of individuals, but what you could share is, I think it's critically important for me to sit down with you and understand your needs and your specific situation and help you develop the next steps based on your situation. Again, the needs of of this community are really varied based on, who you are and what you identify with. So that's the challenge with this community is that again, it's a diverse community in and of itself with diverse planning needs and diverse situations. So that goes back to the not assuming. You can't necessarily have rules of thumb that are going to apply to the entire community. You have to understand their unique situation, and the more you can learn about their situation, the better. In terms of states, the one thing I will share with you is, you're obviously divorces rules are different by state and adoption, but marriage, again, the Supreme Court ruling on the Marriage Act means that, any individual throughout all the 50 states can get married. Obviously, that's one thing that we've heard is, top of mind with this current political climate is this uncertainty of, is that, would there be a repeal? Would that right go away? And we heard that a lot more, I would say, a year or two ago. I think even with the current situation with the pandemic, we're not necessarily seeing a lot of action or legislation outside of that, at least at the current moment. Again, things could change, but I think it feels a little bit different than it did a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm. Is there somewhere, that's a good point, that you don't want to tailor this presentation too closely to one of the sub-communities within this community, but are there, rather than a general financial planning presentation, are there specific issues? And I think you hit on one. If you as an advisor are saying, I am aware of the need to clarify pronouns, are there unique aspects like that that you would want to focus on in any kind of presentation that you can think of?
Sure, and one of the things that I'll encourage all of you to look at is the presentation for investors, and some of the topics that it dives a little bit more into is based on the results of our survey. One of the things we thought was interesting was education came as a big point of importance for recipients in the survey, whether it was children or even members of the family. So like 60% of the individuals in our survey were really focused on 529 plans and planning. So that was one issue. I think another issue to me that's critically important, over half of the research participants said that they were concerned that there would be no one to take care of them when they get older. So planning for health care and elder care, thinking about, is it appropriate for them to have long-term insurance? I think setting, do they have the appropriate amount of funds to care for their health care costs? And then I go back to, I mentioned these briefly, but, having a will, having a health care power of attorney and the durable power of attorney, making sure they have their wishes known and are in writing. And again, that does vary state by state. There are some forms out there that, say that they apply throughout all states, but I think it's important to have a state-specific form, and those are some things that I think can be critically important to this community. Another thing, just think, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, so a follow-on to that, we have a question. Did your study find any material differences in partnerships' financial decisions? For example, were there more prevalent use of life insurance, greater rate of savings, or more charitable giving compared to the non-LGBTQ community? You mentioned the need for it, but do you find people are looking at insurance more closely, or some of these other attributes, characteristics?
So that's a good question. I would say a couple answers. One thing that we thought was very interesting that we do see a big difference is the involvement in the financial and investment decisions. So when we're looking at characteristically straight couples, typically one member of the household is responsible for the investment decisions, the financial decisions. And I mentioned this earlier quickly. In our research, it was a rather large difference. So it was a 50-50 split. And I think that goes back to that self-reliance comment. So to me, one dynamic that may be different in this community is making sure that both members are involved in the financial planning process and up to speed, and that you're involving them equally. We did not specifically ask in terms of usage of things like long-term care products or insurance products. It was more around, what their perceptions of what their needs were. And definitely, I think it goes back to there was a high level of concern about, elder care and the fact that they were concerned there wasn't going to be anyone to help them. And I think as financial advisors, you all can help on that. Another unique financial planning issue, and this goes back to individuals that aren't married, is, you know, the individuals that aren't married, that have had a long-term partnership, aren't going to have access to Social Security benefits. So that's another thing to take into consideration when doing a retirement plan.
So we may not know if these other products have greater uptake, life insurance, et cetera, but certainly the topic is top of mind for these folks. So gearing some of the conversation to that makes sense. Another question here is related to social values. Did your survey reveal that clients thought investing in LGBTQ friendly companies was important?
Yes, so absolutely, and that goes right along the lines of working with a financial advisor that's a member of an LGBTQ community. I think the more difficult thing is to actually operationalize that, and we actually have had you know, a lot of conversations. To my knowledge, there isn't currently a financial product that would, such as like a mutual fund or an ETF, that would have the ability to just invest in LGBTQ friendly companies. But obviously, as a financial advisor, there may be some other avenues that you could work with your client in order to do that. But it does feel like an opportunity. There is. Go ahead.
That also dovetails with the ESG curriculum. That's part of some of the G, I guess. So there may be a fair amount of overlap with that. Do you get a sense that this community is more interested in ESG type investing, or simply because you're focusing on things other than the financial aspect, the governance, et cetera?
Yes, so we definitely, in the survey, we saw that LGBTQ individuals were more focused on companies that value sustainability, equality, absolutely. And HRC is a good organization. As a proxy, they actually do a score for companies. So that's a great resource to go to. Is if you go to hrc.org, you can actually put in a company, and and they actually give a score for the company's LGBTQ friendly policies. So that's a good starting point. And obviously there's a lot of resources out there. I'm sure all of you know Morningstar and other resources that can help you identify companies that, you know, along the ESG lines.
Are there any other sort of pain points or in financial planning or its implementation that this group focuses on? Any advice not being well served that we haven't talked about? There's a lot of detail in your presentation and the white paper that I would again encourage people to get access to. Just fill out the survey after this event, and you can get access to it. But is there anything in there that you might want to highlight or focus on?
So I think it goes back to this advice of thinking about how you can be present and demonstrate that you're either a member of the community or you're an ally. So when we talk to financial advisors working with LGBTQ investors, and even in the survey, I think obviously there's a strong desire to work with a financial advisor who is LGBTQ friendly. I think the difficult part that we have seen is that it is difficult for this community to identify who those advisors are. So the more that you can overtly share that you are either a member of the community or you're an ally, I think that, to me, is the biggest hurdle. We go back to, you know, again, 90% of them weren't sure if Rowe Price was an LGBTQ friendly. They aren't sure. They feel underserved by the financial services community in general. And they want financial advice, but they want to go to an environment where they feel supported and secure. And so I think so there's a lot, again, that goes back to, you know, maybe putting things up in your office, maybe, you know, in social media. So social media, obviously, this community, I would say, is not necessarily different than any other community. I think we found out like half of them use social media to conduct research before they make financial decisions. So look at your website. Is there a way for them to see that you're an LGBTQ friendly advisor on their website? Are you maybe a member of a local pride group on Facebook or LinkedIn? So I think there's a lot of different ways for you to self-identify. And to me, that I think is maybe the first part. Is this community isn't necessarily sure who to go to find a supportive financial advisor. And the more you can illustrate that you are that person without having them to have to ask the question, I think the better served the community will be.
I think there's sort of two follow-ons to that, and one you've mentioned already is the importance of referrals, and I think that is so much more important with this community, where you might ask someone, who do you trust in this area that can address our unique needs? So that's critical, getting into that circle in the first place. But to do that, I think it's really hard. So much of the financial service marketing is kind of tired and stereotyped. The sailboats and the retired couples on the beach. How do you really authentically appeal to this group without it being really ham-handed or stereotyping? It's tough, and it may be one way is to simply Google LGBTQ financial advisors and see who else is out in that space, and more publicly showing that to see what are examples of this.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And again, to me, the Pride Month coming up in June would be a great opportunity for you to engage in local activities. And I think just showing up can be part of that battle, and introducing yourself to members of your local community groups is another way is maybe a little bit indirect, but is another way to make your presence known within the community and be more likely to get referrals.
Do you, in your research, did you determine the level of financial literacy, or is there a financial literacy gap? Our local CFA group has a very strong financial literacy outreach program. And just thinking off the top of my head, this might be a way to craft something for that community if you think and you've seen there's a real need there. As a self-reliant group that's done a lot of its work on its own, there may not be a need there. But have you seen anything that would suggest that would work?
So, and this goes back, I would say, to the diverse part of our community. So if you think about our survey base, and this was intentional just because we were focused on individuals that we felt would be more likely to be financial advisor clients, but we had a higher a higher rate in terms of income and a higher rate in terms of assets in our survey, and typically those translate to higher financial literacy. There's a whole nother cohort of this community that I would say is struggling with financial services, is struggling with financial literacy, and also just struggling with financial issues. And that's almost like a whole nother presentation, I think. And that's one of the things that if you're a financial advisor and you start to get involved in your local GLAD community, you'll see that there's actually probably a real financial need, especially if you look at individuals in the transgender community. There's lots of stats and surveys around some of those individuals in that community have financially precarious situations and need help. And to me, that could be another way that you're demonstrating commitment. Again, our survey is a little bit different. It was skewed towards higher income, higher net worth individuals, and so I would say in our survey and our results, we did not see that. But I think in the broader community, there's obviously an opportunity.
I know I said we were going to avoid COVID-19 discussions, but I thought I'd just ask. I'm guessing there's been and I think we've seen it, there's been a greater focus on wills and asset transfer providing for the next generation and loved ones in this environment. And I'm guessing that would translate into this community as well, not uniquely, but unless, as you said, some of the situations where assets transfer in a way that's a little different than a more traditional aspect. Again, would you think that is a good way to again, discussion topic, to really focus on getting all the paperwork in order, can we say?
Yeah, and that's another great Google search for you to do, is LGBTQ friendly estate planning attorney. So if you want to start to develop, relationships with other professionals that are focused on the community, I think that's a great place to start. Because you're right, there could be some unique estate planning needs depending on their specific situation. And I think the more you can learn about the other individuals, in the Boston area that are serving this community, I think the better you're going to find ways to connect. That was actually one financial advisor that we were in a workshop with shared. That was one thing so he did kind of a tag team approach. He talked about financial planning needs, and he knew a estate planning attorney that focused with LGBTQ investors and had them come up more for a Q&A. So, and this is maybe a tip in general, you don't necessarily have to have an estate planning attorney give a presentation. Not disparaging any estate planning attorneys, but sometimes that's not the most exciting subject matter. When you're interacting with an estate planning attorney, oftentimes people have specific questions, and I've seen that work really well, where the audience is just asking them questions, and oftentimes the entire group finds a lot of value in that collective discussion.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're getting up close to the hour here, and I'll make one more call for questions if folks have them. But I've got one more here. Again, just trying to think how we can take advantage of this opportunity where people's interest is in particular areas. You mentioned the number of business owners. Clearly, business owners are hard against the wall here, smaller businesses particularly. I don't know if there's an angle to this in terms of talking to LGBTQ business owners that in this environment makes sense. We're not really helping them manage their business, but manage their finances, which are obviously in a very different place than they were 3 months ago. Is there any angle there that can be brought to this conversation, you think?
That's a really good question. Again, in our research, so I'm going to make an assumption here, but in our research, again, self-reliance and autonomy and independence, critically important to this group. And one thing we didn't necessarily talk about, we saw higher savings rates in this group and the overall population. And so I'm maybe extending that higher savings rate to say perhaps small business owners who are part of the LGBTQ community might be in a better situation. That feels like a big generalization, but are probably really obviously concerned. And I think that's a hard one, because I don't necessarily know that's any different than any small business owner. But
right, the conversation with the panicked clients is going to be the same across the board.
Yeah, but perhaps they may have a higher state, may be in a better position to survive, because again, there's that fierce need for self-reliance and independence. But that may or may not be.
So there may be a need to help them find the CD or the safe place for cash more so than they have, and so there's a tactical angle there. But this has been a great conversation, and I want to thank Jean for your presentation, and to all of you attendees for listening today. I also want to thank Karen Igler. If any of you have further questions, please feel free to contact Karen at karen.igler@Rowe Price, or you can reach out to the CFAB, and we'll be happy to get back to you. Unless there are any more questions, I think we'll just wrap things up here today. And again, thanks everyone for coming.